What is going on, guys? Hope you're killing it, having a fantastic day. We are going to be learning in this video how to create glow and flow in your images. So stick around and enjoy the video. I'm just going to take you over to the screen here, and we're going to be looking at the photo that we're going to be correcting right now. This shot here I took at the end of last year, so 2019. It's at Bombo Quarry, that's in New South Wales, Australia, and it's one of my favourite locations to shoot. It's literally the first place I ever went to shoot as soon as I started photography. So the first thing that I like to do when I'm first editing and post-processing my image is I scroll all the way down to the lens corrections and click those two on, and I personally like the vignette, so I bring the vignette back down. Next, what I like to do is I just like to play around with the white balance. So daylight, I usually stick on daylight. This one is looking a bit too cool, so I'm just going to warm it up a touch. So basically what I'm trying to do, the Lightroom adjustments, is to balance the whole exposure evenly, so when I jump into Photoshop I have a more kind of direction of where I want the final image to result in, basically. So I'm just going to play around with the shadows and highlights here, bring them down, bring it up, put a bit of contrast, probably a little bit of more warmth. Sharpening I bring all the way down because I can do that as sharpening in post-processing in the Photoshop. And that's basically it. That's my base exposure that I'm going to take into Photoshop and play around with all the curves adjustments and whatnot, which advanced techniques in Photoshop. I feel like with Photoshop it's more kind of localized and you can make adjustments to particular spots of the image, which I find really creative when it comes to my workflow. So I'm just going to import this into Photoshop by right-clicking on the image, edit in Photoshop, and that's going to hopefully take that image and send it to Photoshop. Alright, so once the image is transferred into Photoshop, I like to just always duplicate the background layer by pressing Ctrl J or Command J, or you can just click and drag into this little layer icon down here and that will duplicate it. So I always like to do that just in case I need to go back to my master layer. I'll always make sure that I have a master layer of the overall image. Alright, so next what I do is I like to play around with luminosity mask. The way I don't have any plugins from any photographer, I basically do another method of luminosity masking. If you don't know what that is, search on YouTube, you'll find a ton of videos on there. To do that, I'm going to create a new layer. I'm going to set the blend mode to overlay. Once that blank layer is set to overlay, I create a layer mask. See how it's white? I'm going to click on the layer mask, make sure it's active, head over to image, apply image, and as you can see from here, the white is what's going to be affected and the black is not. So when you're making adjustments, it's only going to affect the white areas. So you can simply invert that, whereas as you can see the white is in the shadows and the black is in the highlights. So that's basically what a luminosity mask does. So what I want to do here is I want to affect the highlights, so I'm going to make sure the brightest part of the areas in the photograph is white. Hit OK, multiply, make sure all the settings are the same on yours. Next, what I want to do is I want to refine that mask. So you can either do this two ways. You can go to image, apply image, and do the exact same thing, and that I'll just show you anyways. Image, apply image, and see how it darkens that mask. That you can do that multiple times to make it more refined, the mask. So I don't want to do that. I like doing it through the levels. I make sure the layer mask is selected. I press Alt and click on the mask, and that will make the whole image go black and white, which is exactly what we want. Next, what you want to do is hit Ctrl L or Command L, and that will bring up the levels. Next, what I want to do, I'm just going to play around with the levels and just try and make a nice contrast between the shadows and the highlights. So I'm mainly looking at this area down here. So I'm just going to make it a bit more contrasty and refined. And I think that's pretty good. So I'm just going to hit OK. Then I'm just going to click on the blank layer. That's going to go back to the normal image. Next, I'm gonna hit the brush tool. I don't want it to be too harsh. I'm just gonna bring the float and the opacity down. Nothing too crazy. And I'm just doing this lightly. I don't want it to be too effective. I'm just gonna zoom in and I'm going to paint white because I want the highlights to be brought up a little bit and brightened. So I'm just going to do that. So with that little adjustment, it made a huge difference. So I'm gonna do the exact same thing with the shadows. So I'm going to create a new layer, set it to overlay, create a layer mask, go to image, apply image, and then I'm going to invert that to just affect the shadows. So I'm gonna do the exact same thing, hit Alt on the layer mask, Control L or Command L, and just refine that kind of contrast between the highlights and the shadows. That's before the adjustments and that is after. So it's a very subtle difference, but it makes a huge impact. Alrighty, next what I like to do is I like to create a kind of vignette but bring up the shadows a little bit. So to do that, I just go to the bottom little circle here, the adjustments layer. I hit curves and that's going to pop up a curves with a layer mask. So what I like to do first is I like to create the highlights. So I'm just going to grab the midtones and just pull that curves up. Next, what I like to do is I like to invert that mask by hitting Control or Command I. That's going to create that layer mask. That's going to put that layer mask into black, so it's going to be invisible. Then what I like to do is I like to grab the gradient tool, hit the circle kind of gradient, I think that is. And then I'm just going to make sure whatever that adjustment is that we just did on the curves, I just want that to affect just pretty much where the highlights is. So I'm going to make sure I'm white because I'm going onto a black layer mask. And because we're on a gradient, we're just going to click and drag where we want that highlight to affect. So I'm just going to play around. And we can always adjust the exposure later on in the curves. So I think that's pretty good. Next, what I want to do, I'm going to Control J, so duplicate that layer. And then what I want to do is I want to Control I to invert it, so it's just going to affect the outside of the image, outside of that highlight adjustment. It's a little confusing, but once you do it a couple of times, you'll understand it and you'll get the hang of it. So Control I, sweet. Next, what I want to do is I want to darken the outside to give it that really cool vignette. So double click on the layer, on the curve layer adjustment. I'm just going to bring up the shadows there to make it that little bit more faded. Awesome. I think that's pretty cool. Alrighty. So I'm just going to title that one Shadows and Highlights. Sweet. I think that the highlights here are just a little bit too much. I'm just going to bring down the exposure on that a little bit. And I'm also going to play around with the blue curve as well, just to give it that kind of bit more tinge to it. Which I think that's pretty good. Awesome. So I think I might just bring up the shadows there a little bit. There we go. Awesome. So with those adjustments before and after, that is a massive difference. Alrighty, next what I want to do is I want to create an Orton effect. If you don't know what that is, it's basically blurring your image on purpose to give it that kind of dreamy look. So we're going to do that now. So I'm going to create an overall flatten layer. To do that, you hold Shift, Command, Alt and E, or Shift, Control, Alt and E, and that's going to flatten all of the layers below that. So next what I want to do is go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. And depending on your camera, depending on the megapixels that your camera has, I'm on the 850, so that's around a 42 megapixel. I like to just halve it. I found around 14 to 20 is fine for me. I'm just going to hit OK. That's going to create a blurred layer. Next, what I want to do is I want to go to the curves at the bottom there. I'm just going to create a nice contrast, like so. Awesome. And then I'm going to clip that onto the blurred layer. So to do that, you just hold Alt and click in between the layers, and that's going to clip it to this is basically the Orton effect layer. So awesome, that's done. What I always like to do, I think around the 20% opacity mark for the Orton effect is around a nice spot. You can always play around with it it's all personal preference. So I usually like it around 20. So that kind of is the sweet spot for me. And depend on your image, it could work for better with other images. It could work a little bit less effective on particular images. So I'm just going to create a layer mask, which I basically want to just localize where I want the Orton effect to be affected in the image, basically. To do that, I'm just going to hold Alt and click on the layer mask. That's going to put a black layer mask, so it's going to hide the Orton effect. Next one I want to do, B for brush, probably bring up the opacity of the brush, and because we're on a black, we want to paint with a white brush. So I'm just going to go through and just click on where I want the Orton effect to be affected. So awesome. Once that's done, you can see the before and after. It's very subtle, but it makes a huge impact. For this image, I think where around the sun is, I want to kind of bring the exposure down a little bit because I think it's just a little bit too overexposed at the moment. So I'm just going to simply just get a curves, bring down the midtones, bring up the shadows, bring down the highlights, and just play around with that. And I'm going to do the same thing what we did with the vignette. So I'm just going to invert that, G or the gradient tool, the circle gradient, and then I'm just going to click reverse, and then I'm just going to click and drag just where I want that curves to be affected. So I'm looking just at the top half because I can always just mask out the rest of it. So I'm pretty happy with that. B for brush, because we're on a white, we got to paint with a black to reveal what's underneath it. And I'm just going to bring up the opacity and flow and just paint back where you want the under layer to kind of reveal. So I'm just going to bring down the opacity. What I always like to do after an edit, I like to completely flatten it all. Some photographers and some editors probably disagree with that, but I like to do it because you can see some of these banding that goes across with all the adjustments that have been created. So I just like to flatten it just so I can clear out. You'll be able to see when I do this now. So if I hit Control, Shift, Alt and E, you'll see those lines just disappear. See that? So that's why I always like to do that at the end of an edit. Alrighty, and next what I'd like to do is just Control E on all of those layers to flatten it, and you'll be able to see the before and after. So I hope you guys did enjoy this little video. If you did learn something new or you did find this interesting or entertaining, feel free to subscribe and like this video, and let me know how you went with this post-processing techniques. This is basically my whole workflow. I usually do more localized adjustments, but I've just done a global sort of overview on how to create flow in the images and how to give it that dreamy sort of look. So hope you guys do have a great rest of your evening. Like what I said, be sure to subscribe and like this video, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Catch you later, guys.